Well, we've reached the last of our trialogues, and so it's fitting that we should cast our minds toward last things, since this both seems to be the theme of the crisis of the present moment and also the unique unifying thread throughout the Western religion that most insistently of all religious systems on earth, it is the Western systems that have insisted in appointing an end to their world. The cyclical worlds of Hinduism are cycles of time so vast that they lose all force on the popular imagination. But what uniquely distinguishes Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is this insistence that God will come tangential to history in a way that will create a scenario of last days, of a great uptaking of souls into the mystery of God. This idea, which is called apocalyptic in its more catastrophic version and millenarian in its more pastoral version, is the idea that is the necessary correlative to the concept of Eden and the unique moment of man's creation by God. If man's creation occurred at a unique moment in the history of the universe, then presumably after the expiation of the sin of Eden, God will gather man once again into the mystery. So this idea, which when encountered outside the religious framework in individuals, in a secular or desacralized vocabulary, is labeled pathology. The expectation of imminent transformation of the environment with the individual somehow playing a central role, this recognized pathological symptom in the individual is nevertheless the driving force behind much of our own civilization. We, as educated rationalists, the most rational 5% of society, in spite of our pretensions to intellectual revolution, we are far, I believe, from feeling the real force of what this is. But at the folkloric level, the attractor of the end of the world is very strong. And you may recall some 5 years ago, the Secretary of the Interior was asked why he wasn't saving more of America's forests. And he replied that since Jesus was coming, he saw no reason to save the forests because the end of the world was imminent. So I find this thinking very interesting, and I have personally certainly experienced its power. What is this intuition of the end of the world? And now that we're beginning to gather more data, that science is actually beginning to pay back on the promises made in the 18th century and give us a complete and deep description of at least the physical and astronomical universe, what we're seeing is a highly chaotic domain. There isn't a stable body in the solar system that isn't deeply pockmarked with asteroidal impact. From the inner planets to the moons of the gas giants, there is tremendous visual evidence of catastrophic episodes throughout the history of the solar system. So we discussed in another meeting inconsistencies in nuclear theory with the output of neutrinos from the sun. Is there a problem there? Human history itself, to my mind, can be seen as a kind of shock wave attendant upon the eschatology. That if we were to imagine for a moment that God or a super transmundane mind were to enter into the ordinary biological and evolutionary life of a planet, then I think we would have to agree that there would be some kind of shockwave of anticipation, some kind of sense of the imminence of the disruption of ordinary events before it was in fact imminent. And this very brief period which we have experienced over the past 20,000 years is this thing, I believe. And these religions which have anticipated this thing in this rather crude end of the world scenario are somehow on to something that is, I think, a message coming from the biological level, if you will, about the inherent instability of the world. Ralph's models and Prigoghine's models and all this has established the role of the unexpected perturbation in the creation of the cosmos, but I don't think we've quite factored it into our day-to-day model of what's going on. One of the startling things that I find when I look back on my own life of slightly more than 40 years is the number of things that have happened in my life that we were told would never happen. I mean, I have seen presidents assassinated, human beings landed on the moon, robots to Mars, all of these high improbabilities in a single lifespan, which we all share. So I think that we are sort of on automatic pilot with our assumptions that in spite of all our theory making, we are living in basically a probabilistic, synchronistically flattened universal plane. What if the urgency and the uniqueness of the human historical moment actually signaled yet more urgent and even more exotic moments to come, and that we are somehow witness to a major phase transition in the career of self-reflecting bios in the universe, and that for us it's the end of the world. But, this is a meaningless phrase. It's simply a complete systemic reorganization on the scale of metamorphosis in Lepidoptera. It's just a complete meltdown of the previous world system, and then a recasting at the behest of higher mind, Gaian mind, the world soul. It isn't clear, but if we could strip the provincialism from the message of these apocalyptic religions, I think they explain what history is. They have a deep intuition of instability, and in the same way that I described the reluctance of plants in a botanical garden to venture out on an unstable tree limb, I think these apocalyptic religions are they are all prophetistic religions. They are trying to extract something out of the human future that is of no casual interest. It may in fact involve the survival, yes or no, of the planet. So I'm interested in ideas like that the transcendental object is somehow leaking information back into the past at a 3% rate or something like that, that shamans and mystics and psychedelic travelers are in fact getting a very incomplete, low-grade signal about this event that is, I think, based on what we talked about last night, somehow built into the structure of space and time, that the presence of our minds indicates that we are very near this enormous concressing singularity. Minds cannot exist except within, 25,000 years of complete concrescence of one of these things. They do not arise in parts of the universe where concrescence is not approaching its climax. So I don't really know the relevance of all this for theory making if in fact the concrescence is upon us. Then really all we can do is chat about it as it comes down around our ears over the next 25 years. And we are in such a tidal grip of the field that it really doesn't matter. We can only observe it, having the meager satisfaction that we made a amusing model of it. If longer periods of time are available, then it might be worthwhile to undertake to study this phenomenon and its role in human history, and so forth and so on. But it's more than simply the calendrical pressure from the approach of the second millennium. It's also all these graphs drawn by very straight people of resources and population density and demand for hydroelectric energy and levels of strontium in milk and all of this stuff. I mean, who can look at all this stuff and not say it's either the yawning grave or there's going to be the lake is going to turn over. There's going to be a complete system reversal because this cannot go on. It's abiotic. And I think life has a terrifying tenaciousness. I mean, life seized hold of this planet 1 billion years ago, 1.5 billion, 2 billion years ago, and managed it through hellfire again and again, managed it back towards stable equilibria that were supportive of biota. And, there were asteroid infalls and continents ground to dust, and we don't even know what went on. And life kept hold of this chunk of ground. So I think the advent of intelligence must signal a crisis of a greater magnitude. That's why I suggest that the stellar dynamics should be looked at very carefully or something like that. It's a different order of magnitude. And it's seeping into our religions and into our politics and into our psychedelic experiences and into the general imagination. I think we're standing on the lip of a hyperdimensional volcano of some sort toward which all history is being poured at a great rate. We have the peculiar good fortune of fulfilling the wish conveyed in the Irish toast, "May you be alive at the end of the world." So that's it, gentlemen. Now we can just kick this around.
Some questions come up.
Yes.
There seem to be two stages to this apocalyptic vision, this particular one. The first stage is the confidence in an apocalypse coming sometime. And the other component is the location of the date, 20 years or so hence.
Mm-hmm. You mean in my personal belief?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So, in about the first one, it does seem sort of logical somehow that if there's a Big Bang at the beginning and there would be a Big Bang at the end, and the creation story in Genesis and the precedent myths might somehow be seen to imply that, but I don't know. I wouldn't think that's enough to go on, But then you said that in these traditions, Hebrew, Christian, Islam, that there's a definite tradition of an end, in the mild form, the millenarian, in the strong form, the apocalyptic.
Correct.
Well, what is it exactly? What is the Secretary of the Interior referring to?
He's referring to
in the Gospels or somewhere.
No, in the Revelation of St. John, this thing is laid out. It's very complex. Angels come and pour down diseases. Oceans boil. It takes a long time. There are plagues of scorpion-like creatures that come from the interior of the earth. Certain people are marked with a sign, and they are the elect. And it's just this completely bizarre production that is one of the most puzzling pieces of literature in the Christian canon.
the textual basis for this fantasy is entirely this revelation of St. John the Divine.
That's right. And
is that the apocalyptic, the millenarian, or both?
Both.
Yes, because at the end you see the 12-gated city, the New Jerusalem, a flying saucer comes. I mean, you can tell. I mean, the description is, it's covered with jewels. It has 12 gates. It's God's kingdom come to earth, and it comes to receive the elect. And as the oceans boil away and the damned are dragged into hell for eternity, these people with these special things shining in their heads go into this thing to be with God in eternity. And the whole thing is flushed.
We'll have the sunglasses specially ready to sell them. In this textual basis for this fantasy,
yes.
Is there any idea about the date?
Well, yeah. At the time of Christ, the people who immediately followed Christ expected it within their lifetime. Amen, amen, I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away until these things are accomplished.
It was expected immediately?
Immediately, and there was this weird...
There's been disappointment after disappointment.
Well, yes, there was this weird 120-year period where they didn't get the serious job of getting organized together because everybody was standing around waiting for the end of the world. And then after about 120 years, people like Origen and Eusebius and these people came forward and said, listen, enough of this waiting for the end of the world. We have to get this scene organized.
It's seriously overdue.
Yes, let's get organized and get our hands on some real estate.
Now that it's so seriously overdue and people have been disappointed time after time,
yes,
I would think that the force of the prophecy has declined. In any case, I just want to ask you this. Have you any way of guessing why the Secretary of the Interior thought that the end was coming imminently? I know why you think so.
Oh, yes, because there are all these fundamentalist cults in the United States, some whose adherents number in the tens of millions, who believe that, that it's happening, that it's underway. I mean, within the spectrum of Christian belief, you can go with the Seventh-day Adventists who hold the most extreme position, which is that it occurred in 1847. I love that position. And that we are now living in the millennium. This is the millennium.
Yeah, can't you tell?
So that's the most right-wing view. And then there are those who undergo the formality of at least locating the date decently in the near future, and the year 2000, and it's the end, the turning of the aeon. Everybody has a way of decoding. This is one of the weird things about millenarian speculation. The person who discovers the key to the millenarian date, it always is just a few years ahead.
It's you. Now, I just have a couple more questions for the direct examination, then we'll turn the witness over for the cross-examination.
Okay.
How many, what percentage more or less of the human population of planet Earth at the moment is involved in this Hebrew, Christian, and Islam religion?
Third, I'd say.
I should say maybe.
However, if you're trying to count the adherents to the apocalypse theory, you have to count all the adherents of scientism as well, because they too, with their greenhouse effects and CFCs and acid rain, I mean, they're the most...
That's another story. I do think that might be even a bigger danger, but that's another story. Right now, I'm after the revelation of St. John the Divine.
No, this is the end of the world scenario of scientism.
And then we've had the end of the world scenario of nuclear holocaust hanging over for decades.
That's right.
That's a ready-to-hand scenario.
Oh, yeah, the oceans...
But it's coming from the same culture. But I just wonder how much credibility to give to the Christian apocalyptic vision when less than half the human population is involved. It doesn't mean that just that half of the planet would be vaporized while the other half kept on going because
I don't think it's a vaporizing. What it is all these scenarios are metaphors for something really weird.
Well,
which
that's
we are
true.
in a
I know
much
about the flying
better,
saucer.
we're
But you
in a
did
much
mention
better
the
position to anticipate it than John the Divine of Patmos was.
well, you sort of started on the scientific end with the mention of the astronomical chaos and the
Right.
craters on all the other bodies and the fall of neutrinos from the sun and so on.
Catastrophic scenarios, you mean?
Yes.
Yes. Well, the positive scenarios are simply more far-fetched. I mean, one of the ones I've been playing with recently that I really like is that it ain't no big deal. It's just that time travel is discovered. It's a technological artifact. It's done in
The
laboratories.
door is opened on this little tunnel and you just walk through.
And history ends. History ends. Just bang, it ends. And that's the end of history. And people look back at it the way you look back at the Pueblos or something and say, you know, people used to live like that in linear time. Weird. All you know, waiting for stuff to happen and all in this weird jelly of stiffened dimensionality. And boy, aren't we glad we've got that behind us. And to the people who were born in it, the previous mode of existence would be mere rumor. And it would be simply a technological artifact. I think that this actually, after reading Nick Herbert's book, this, did I talk to you about the idea about the kind of time machine where he hypothesized this notion of a principle which works like this. Time travel is possible. Once it's discovered, you'll be able to travel into the future. When you're in the future, you'll be able to travel back into the past, but no further than the moment of the discovery of the first time machine. Because before that moment, there were no time machines, and how can you take a time machine into a universe where time machines don't exist?
With nobody knowing it.
Yes. So there is this physical barrier to time travel past the moment of discovery of it, backward before that moment. Well, I thought this was very interesting because I wanted to imagine, this is a practical apocalypse. This is I wanted to imagine what would it be like if this kind of time machine were discovered. And so I imagined that it's December 22nd, 2012 AD at the La Chorrera World Temporal Mechanics Institute, and they're counting down, and the Lady Temponaut has been strapped into the time machine, and they count down and they push the button and she sails off into the future. Now the interesting question is, what happens right there in the next moment?
Millions of people arrive from the more populated part of the universe.
Millions of time machines arrive from all possible
little
parts
capsules,
of the future.
Sneaking through the bushes, pretending they were there all the time, asking for groceries.
To see the moment, this historic moment, the first time travel, which defines the barrier as far as you can go in your time machine. And people say to each other, have you been to the edge? It's 35,000 years from here. Have you been back and seen the Abraham machine take off? Well, so I loved this idea, and I held it for about 48 hours as a great gimmick. And then I realized that there was a peculiar problem with it, which has to do with the grandfather paradox, that one of these people from the far future could stop off on their way back to see Ralph's machine take off. They could stop off and kill their grandfather and set this paradox in motion, which has been the defeat of all time travel schemes. So then I had what I believe is a serious delusional breakthrough, which was, I said, aha, there's something, here's the model that you have to understand the next stage of this argument about the apocalypse. You know how the Bernoulli gas laws work. So imagine a vacuum-filled elliptical tank. We introduce a burst of oxygen at one end of this tank, Now, according to Bernoulli's laws, what happens? It diffuses evenly throughout and comes to a state of equilibrium, correct? Well, let's think for a moment of the planet. Now we'll make a geometric model, one dimension down. Think of how today, 1989, on this planet, we have all kinds of different levels of cultural achievement, like we have central Tokyo and Beverly Hills, but we also have Amazon rainforest people and pygmies and Berbers and all these people. Well, now if you think of cultural values and technological prowess and scientific acumen as particles in this gaseous environment, then which way do you think values are moving in order to establish equilibrium? Well, the answer is obvious. More people in the Amazon are interested in what the Japanese are thinking than Japanese are interested in what Amazonian Indians are thinking. In other words, the higher state of cultural accomplishment is slowly swamping all less advanced states of cultural accomplishment, without arguing about what these terms mean in terms of advanced. But one culture is swamping another. Okay, to return to the time travel problem then, a weird effect would ensue upon the invention of this forward-going kind of time travel that I'm hypothesizing. It can be described with several different linguistic models. One way of saying it is when the Lady Temponaut goes off into the future, all of the rest of the future, unto, as Wordsworth says, as long as date shall give a name to time, all of that future undergoes some kind of collapse and happens instantly.
Yeah.
It happens instantly, so that the most advanced state of human accomplishment, even if it be billions of years in the future and absolutely beyond our ability to imagine in any way, will appear 1 millisecond later on the other side of this barrier. So then I thought, my God, we're not inventing time travel here. What we're inventing is
time death.
A God whistle. That's what it is. It's a God whistle. You create this technology, and it just takes the entire future history of the universe up until its conclusion and compresses it down into the next few milliseconds as the thing spins down, and then you are face to face with the end purpose of all evolution and all process and all pattern and all energy, space, time, and matter. I mean, you come out next to the big girl, and this would work, I think.
This is not the edge of the West, it's the edge of the rest.
The edge of the rest, yes. So there you have it. A complete fulfillment of the monotheistic intuition of apocalypse. And what it is, it's wonderful. It's that we figured it out. It's like the universe is this huge conundrum, and you're in there and you're suffering, and it's just this weird trip, and then there's science and religion and magic, and you're fumbling, and then you slowly go toward this thing, and it turns out the stone is real. There is alchemical gold, and when you grasp this to yourself, then, time ends, space ends, matter ends, everything ends, and you go into the conclusion, the payoff, the jackpot. It's you go over the cusp and you meet the management.
Probably this hasn't happened yet.
No, 2012, I think.
That brings us to the second question. As to this 2012, as already discussed, there were different alternatives in the interpretation of this date as based on the time wave by itself, such as a reflection point of zero novelty and so on. So I think that this particular apocalyptic fantasy of yours is actually a syncretism between the apocalyptic paranoia on the one hand and the time wave on the other hand. because even if one is convinced of apocalypse but not knowing when, it's not necessary to associate it to the year 2012.
No, it certainly isn't. It isn't necessary to associate it with that. That's a more, you enter into the slippery realm of human judgment and data fields and this and that. The fact that it fits it so well, and that without the time wave, there is all this millenarian and apocalyptic pressure because of the turn of the millennium, seems pretty suggestive to me. The Mayan thing is another coincidence. I mean, really, the Mayans and the Christians were within 12 years of each other in a way, if you take the year 2000.
We have the coincidence of several sacred documents.
Yes.
The revelation of St. John the Divine.
Yes.
The time wave, another sacred document in software form. And
the Mayan
software.
And the Judeo-Christian calendar, or the Gregorian calendar.
No, I don't think a round number like 2000 has got anything to do. I mean, it didn't happen in the year 1000.
No, but there was millenarian hysteria like you wouldn't believe. I mean, they didn't get any work done for 2 years.
Ruth Benedict had studied 60 different cultures, and she charted them out by all different parameters, and finally she sorted them into 3 bins: the Apollonian, the Dionysian, and the paranoid. Now, it just happens that a paranoid culture, having this paranoid religion, or at least with a paranoid element in it, contributed by St. John the Divine, happened to get these extraordinary technical powers which are great generators of toxicity and so on.
Well, the term paranoid is designed to make you not like it. The implicit point of view in calling it paranoid is one of scientism. Having been called paranoid, I know that this is what they do. If you're labeled this, nobody's going to look into it. It makes the implicit assumption that there's nothing to be paranoid about. Yet, in fact, we live in a very peculiar and dynamic and unsteady universe, and it's very important to us as creatures to have stability, equilibrium, and evenness of conditions. So to argue it isn't paranoia, it may well, in fact, be a sensitivity to the...
They always say that. Yes, that's fine, but the fact is, from my point of view, I mean, I'm just a person hanging around here. I've never read the Revelation of St. John the Divine. Maybe I will, or maybe I won't. If I do read it, I certainly don't believe that it's any kind of document with any credibility. You see, I know that there are some fundamentalist Christians around who take every word of the Bible very seriously, and they believe it. But here's like somebody, as far as I'm concerned, somebody's paranoid fantasy was put down in a book.
Well, no, I don't.
Seriously, so now they're paranoid.
I don't
too.
think Revelations is the interesting thing to discuss.
What's the interesting thing? Where
possible scenarios of sudden catastrophic phase transition in the natural world.
Winter, I believe in that.
Well, but these are mundane. I mean, I outlined one for you that had a little teeth in it. There are others. Collision, this thing we talked about where the matter and antimatter universes collide and leave a photonic shell under the aegis of a new physics.
Well, that's like scheduled for 5 billion years hence. Hard to get
or tomorrow. There is no way to predict when such a thing would happen, and the notion that it's far away. You see, the presence of minds is the signifier of nearby singularity.
It's totally hypothetical anyway. It's just a model.
That idea that minds signify the nearby approach of a singularity.
And the anti-universe in the synchroclash.
Oh yeah, I know, but you can put 20 or 30 of these things. There are all kinds
I think the asteroid collision, a comet, that's likely. There was a near pass recently. I think it was last month.
Oh yes, and did you see when it's coming back? 2012. And it's going to come closer.
That's the last one. Now I believe it myself.
I clipped it out of Astronomy magazine. I knew people would doubt. They said, exact computation is impossible, but late in 2012.
No, but the author was some fan of yours.
No, it was Astronomy Magazine. It was a Lick Observatory or something.
All right. I'm ready to admit that there are a number of coincidences about the year 2012, and some of them are ominous.
Well, I'm very hopeful, and I lead the movement.
Any credibility to St. John the Divine? No,
I don't give St. John the Divine any credibility, except that...
The only thing is that from the morphogenetic field point of view, there's quite a number of people believing St. John the Divine. Now, that I have to take seriously.
He felt a quaking in the force, that's all. But it's up to cooler heads to figure out what this quaking of the force is. I mean, we have much better techniques than John the Divine.
See, nuclear winter is much more likely than any of these other things we discussed.
Well, but see, I don't think a nuclear war is likely. But without a nuclear war, just with continued toxification, CO2 outgassing, CFCs, the scenario is totally apocalyptic.
See, I think we are facing a serious ecological crisis, an evolutionary challenge of unprecedented. You know, James Lovelock.
If we don't have a miracle every day, we're not going to make
the present extinction is one of the 8th largest catastrophes of the planet in its lifetime.
So far.
So and so that's happening now. Like, we are in something that big. I mean, it's not big. To be the biggest one, it'd be the apocalypse.
Well, that's why you don't need John the Divine to tell you that there's an apocalypse underway. The scientists...
But it may not be a fatal one, because there's not a prophecy with any credibility to me that says there isn't some way to make it true, although I have to admit I'm extremely doubtful of the intelligence of the species to find
Well, it depends on what's causing the problem. If you think man is the problem...
Man is the problem.
Well, what about this sudden appearance of large and repeated glaciations in the last 5 million years? This indicates either something is wrong with the sun or the geodynamics of the planet. There never were glaciers before. No, there never were glaciers before. Glaciers are new in the life of the Earth. They're not something that you see back and back and back. And all parameters of planetary stability become more and more unstable as you approach the present. Now, is that just that the older a planet is...
We're hovering in a field of chaos, yes.
Well... So maybe man is the problem, or maybe human beings are the answer.
Well, the Earth could zip off its orbit and head out to space. That's a possibility. But it does seem to me that the ecological catastrophe is the appropriate interpretation of the apocalyptic vision at the present time.
I agree with that.
Well, so do I, but I don't think there are alternative views, because historically speaking, this millenarian apocalyptic tendency in Christianity, which inspired millenarian movements through the ages, inspired, among others, the Pilgrim Fathers to come to a new world in America, which was seen as the chosen land. You know, it's all part of the same kind of thing, this prophetic tradition of... and it also inspired Bacon's vision of unlimited progress through science and technology, through organized research, the transformation of nature, man's conquest of nature, through putting nature on the rack and torturing her. This man's dominion over nature was there in order to bring about a kind of millenarian state, a technological utopia, the first technological utopia, where there'd be peace and prosperity, and there'd be these wise scientist priest figures running everything and always finding out ways to make things better. So it was the idea of a kind of new Eden, or a new promised land, flowing with milk and honey and material abundance, etc., through the scientific control and conquest of nature. Well, it's that scenario which is now causing the economic catastrophes. That scenario has actually worked. And there's a sense in which the apocalyptic scenario we find ourselves in is a product of the apocalyptic myth of history.
Yes, good point.
So it's, in a sense, a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes.
And I think that the tendency of the myths of science have an interesting dynamic, because they start with the Faust myths, where Faust sells his soul to the devil in return for unlimited knowledge and power for a fixed period, 24 years. But when you get to the later development, at the end of the period, Faust is dragged down to hell, and then in Goethe's Faust, because he's an Enlightenment figure who believes in progress, Faust is actually taken up to heaven. He's rescued from the demons at the last minute. That all became implausible, and the modern form of the Faust myth was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where the scientist is destroyed by his own creation, no longer by any supernatural machinery. That the whole of the kind of supernatural machinery of Faust becomes natural destruction by his own monster in the case of Frankenstein. And it's obvious that the nuclear threat has a Frankenstein quality to it. And it's also obvious that the destruction of the environment, the ecological crisis, has this kind of mythological base, which is apocalyptic.
Good point.
Well, we have to do surgery on the mythological base due to the self-fulfilling prophecy mechanism that while we don't understand it exactly, we see it working in history. So, in connection with revision of the religion of the West, I think one good thing would be a modification of the revelation of St. John, or relegation of it to another place. I mean, it has to be, I think, reinterpretation was the word you suggested.
You need to switch the vision onto another track.
Yes.
Yes, well,
yes,
how can we control the
self-fulfillment is out of control.
So that even though the self-fulfilling part of it can't be stopped, it can be steered toward a tolerable conclusion.
Well, first one historical note, that the revelation of St. John the Divine is not a unique phenomenon in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's in a succession of apocalyptic books which abounded around the time of Christ, because many people believed that the end was literally at hand. St. John the Baptist's message was repent, for the end is at hand. It was a period very similar to our own, in the sense that the idea of the end being at hand was widely believed, only too credible to them, for whatever their reasons were. The book of Daniel in the Old Testament is an apocalyptic prophetic book, and is a precursor of the revelation of St. John the Divine. These are just two examples in a large and extensive literature. It pervades the teachings of Jesus, this apocalyptic sense of the changing of everything. So, where was I?
About Daniel.
Oh yes, Daniel, that it pervades the thing, and it comes very early on, because the promise of to Abraham, it starts with Abraham. God promises Abraham that he'll take him and his descendants to another land. He'll give them a land. There's a promise of a land where wonderful things will happen. Abraham's children shall be as the sands of the sea, and he shall be the father of many nations. And these are promises about things that haven't happened but will happen. And through faith in these promises, history is made. And there's a passage in the 11th chapter of the Epistle to the Hebrews, which is in the New Testament, a doctrine to Jewish Christians. And there's a whole sermon on faith, how the entire motor of history for the Jewish people was this faith in what they hadn't yet seen. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the passage begins. And by faith Abraham went out to find a strange land, not having seen it, or even glimpsed it afar off. By faith Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt to the promised land. And then by faith Noah built the ark, knowing not for what or when. And so when the rains came, he'd already built this ark, and everyone else was drowned, and he and his family took off. All these things are done by faith, and it ends with this thing about how we are moving by faith towards a new state, a promised land. Because if we belong to the cities of the world as we know them, we'd go back to those cities, but we're moving onwards. And it ends with that famous passage, we are strangers and pilgrims in this land. So there's this sense of being on a journey through time towards some destiny in the future, which can be a different place, like America. The Pilgrim Fathers were inspired by this mythology to come to America and see in it a new promised land. It's inspired the migratory urges of the northern Europeans for centuries now, this vision. And it's also inspired the attempt to change the world through science and technology, but it's so deeply rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition that mere tampering with the book of Revelation won't make it go away. It's fundamental to the entire historical orientation of the religion.
We need to direct it toward a non-lethal, satisfying conclusion.
Well, the momentum can't be... I don't think the momentum of the technological effects of all this can be stopped.
Or at least certainly not in a short...
Considering this possibility that I mentioned at the beginning, Ralph, which is that there is this intuition is of something profound, that it isn't simply a lethal neurosis, it's the actual anticipation of what is now made inevitable by all this technology.
Well, in that case, there's no problem.
No,
we're not going to reject the inevitable. We just, as you suggested, sort of like get used to it happening.
Well, get used to the fact it could happen at any time. You see, Terence is so much like St. John, in both in his St. John the Baptist form and in St. John the Divine. There's, in the Gospels, there's these passages of Jesus which Terence could easily quote and add to his armamentarium.
Is this Nicodemus, what Christ told Nicodemus?
No, it's his prophecies in St. Luke's Gospel about how when the kingdom of heaven comes, when it will be like a thief in the night. And, you know, in the parable of the 7 wise and foolish virgins who are not ready for the end, many stories that say that, you know, when it comes, it'll come suddenly and you won't know when it's coming. And you have to live...
a thief in the night, and no man will know the moment of my coming.
Well, I'm yielding now to Terence's view that there's no way to save this vehicle, that the basic scriptures are riddled with a self-fulfilling prophecy of apocalypse, and either there is an inevitable apocalypse on the horizon, or, in case there's not, one might be created by the self-fulfilling prophecy, the mechanism of paranoid delusion. Then we would have to defuse the time bomb of the Bible.
That's a good way of thinking it. Yes.
And the Quran.
People should be allowed to let the apocalypse happen, not make it happen.
Yeah.
Which if culture is a fantasy coming out of the unconscious, then, you know, we have set ourselves up for this. It's now going to be very delicate to ride this through, understand it, stop it, back out.
So the myth of apocalypse, is this then one of the major weaknesses of this system from the evolutionary point of view?
It's what enabled us to understand and discover the evolutionary point of view. The evolutionary point of view is the apocalyptic vision of history writ large, surely. I mean, the very fact that the notion of human progress
made progress requires the beginning, the middle, and the end, and we've even got it.
Yes. And the thing is that from the idea of human progress, which was widespread by the end of the 18th century, the idea of biological progress, i.e. the same process recognized in the human realm but extended to all life, seemed increasingly plausible to many people, because the idea of life as totally static and the whole of nature as utterly frozen, with only humans developing in this mode. You see, when Hegel showed the dialectical development of thought, it was a fairly obvious idea that Marx and others took up, of thinking of a kind of evolutionary development of matter as well. In other words, seeing the evolutionary process as not just a human one, but involving all life, and then since 1966, the entire cosmos, with Big Bang cosmology. So I would say that the Big Bang cosmology, which is an apocalyptic vision of history with an explosive beginning and therefore implying an explosive end, is simply a projection, well, I shouldn't say simply, but is a kind of projection of this Judeo-Christian model of history. It's not just confined to churches and synagogues. It's something which has come to be. It's the myth which encloses our entire scientific worldview, which has grown up within this Judeo-Christian matrix.
Yes.
And it started in the human realm, then it spread to...
Apocalyptarian.
Good.
It seems inevitable.
It is inevitable.
But you see, the evolutionary view gives us a sort of vast time scale for this process. It basically, it's still in the same model. It says, sooner or later, maybe in 5, maybe 10 billion years, our sun will explode. It will follow the course of a grade 3 star, or whatever it's classified
Not that
as.
we know what the course is.
But the typical course of such a star, we say airily, having observed stars for a few
years.
decades.
50 years of careful observation.
And big supernovas that tell us what happens when the star blows up are things that we've observed occasionally. Like one in 1987. Anyway, so the theory is, it's just a star. It will, like any other star, burn out. It'll either become a red giant or a black hole. I've forgotten which it'll become. But at any rate, that's the end for us. So the scientific worldview actually does have the same thing. It has, I think, the sun becoming a supernova or a red giant and killing everything in the solar system. That would be our end. And it would be one that mirrored the Big Bang as a kind of incandescent beginning. That's the scientific view. That is an apocalyptic view.
It's just a few years.
But it's just that it transfers the apocalypse to the remote future.
Conveniently
So that you don't have to. It doesn't get rid of it.
Yes.
It has it. And the heat death of the old thermodynamic 19th century universe, the steam engine running out of steam, was a kind of slow but inevitable ending of time. The heat death of the cosmos was when entropy was at a maximum and processes, work, and that kind of thing came to an end. And so it was a kind of...
But you see,
So now we're down to this. We're accepting the apocalypse myth because it's an integral part of the historical concept as the Israelites invented it. And we can't do anything about that. And nevertheless, this has no implication at all as to the overall longevity of our human habitation on Earth.
No, I disagree.
So therefore, the paranoia of our culture is manifest in the assumption that it's happening tomorrow.
Except that there's ample evidence. It isn't paranoia. Who
Ample
else
evidence.
has nuclear stockpiles? Who else has Agent Orange?
Nuclear
Who
looks
else
bad.
has CFCs dissolving the ozone hole? This is not paranoia. Paranoia? The Earth is on fire. Haven't you heard? There's no reason to worry about being too paranoid. You can lift your foot off that pedal. It's okay. You can go with that intuition now. The planet is on fire.
To fasten the fire to a complete incineration in a certain year, no matter what the response.
No, that's not what's being said. You can interpret it as the smeared apocalypse that takes 200 years but still ends with everybody dead at the end of it. Or the fast apocalypse that takes 15 minutes and could happen today or tomorrow. There are all these styles of imagining it, but the thing
The
is...
style matters. I think this.
But all the
style,
possibilities are real.
The projection of the apocalypse in the year 2012, I think, is actually damaging of our chances of having a future.
No, I think it's a way to manage it. If it's just, it could be tomorrow, it could be 200 years from now, that's a little weird. Why not manage ourselves through a narrow neck in a state of high awareness by, there should be tremendous pressure on governments to get rid of nuclear stockpiles by 2000.
Yes,
to actually,
sure.
but to use the calendar as a club, saying, do you want to enter the third millennium armed like barbarians? Do you want to be just like King Canute? He was who was in charge at the turn of the last millennium. You want them to hold you up to King Canute and say, Canute, Bush, 2 Viking warlords, 2 knotheads? Or do you want to drape yourself in the olive of peace and be, the savior of the world, the unifier of mankind, and so forth and so on? It's a great
What I'm
thing
suggesting is that the coupling of the apocalyptic vision of the revelation of St. John with the concept of the end of time in the year 2012 makes most likely the response of the Secretary of the Interior, who says, well, so what? I mean, there's nothing we can do about it, so let it go.
Going back to the revelation, John, which I would have seen, I could have seen this discussion go on with never a mention of it. That's just an obscure Christian text, interesting to fanatics. But the overall world...
But the whole idea,
or this issue,
what idea is evoked in people's minds through use of the word apocalypse, our subject here.
Well, I called it the end of the world.
Good, that's much better.
It was my notion.
That lets John off the hook and the Bible.
The end of the world.
All right. The proposal of the end of the world happening in a fixed year is not inclining people to do something about nuclear stockpiles by the year 2000. Like, who cares if the last 12 years have or do not have nuclear stockpiles?
No, I didn't link the two together. I meant that the year 2000 everyone wants to celebrate the millennium by feeling like there's a new style, a breath of fresh air, a new order. So the year 2000, forget 20.
Perestroika in the United States.
There should be
that would be something.
A thorough examination on the part of everybody of their society as we approach the third millennium.
That sounds good.
That would be a fine thing, I think. You know, it's interesting, when they tested the first atomic bomb at Trinity site at Alamogordo, of the 19 physicists who observed it, there were 6 who believed that the temperatures were high enough to ignite the atmosphere, and that the entire planet was there was a 30% chance that the entire planet's atmosphere would be set on fire by this experiment. And they went forward. They had no reason to believe that this wouldn't happen.
That would be an interesting experiment.
Well, it didn't happen. It's not hot enough. I wonder how
that
hot
was a close one.
That was a close one.
And this comet coming back in 2012 looks like a close one. That's the definition of a close one.
That's a close one. And the
population explosion. What about projecting the population explosion to the year 2012? How many people would that be if it continued apace?
I don't know. It depends on whose figures you use, but probably approaching 10 billion. 10 billion people. Ozone. If you take the ozone hole, which we know that's a problem, propagated at the present rate of phase, there will be no ozone hole. So you've got 10 billion people, no ozone hole. The impact of that single parameter is totally unknown. The carbon dioxide emission continues. That's a whole other issue. The acid rain continues. Nuclear proliferation continues. Propaganda runs rampant. Meanwhile, pharmacology, brainwashing, surgical reconstruction, all of this stuff has made new leaps toward great fascist accomplishments. I mean, it's a pressure cooker world that we're describing. And I think under such conditions of cultural compression, forms of novelty will erupt that are totally unpredictable in the present context, and that these are the forces that will create the end of the world. I mean, I think of it sort of like the DMT wave hits the planet or something like that. So much is happening. Everything is knitting together. It cannot be stopped. I mean, there will be cellular technology and human-machine interface and uploading and downloading of clones of people and memories and places, and everything, the boundaries are dissolving into some kind of techno-biological informational soup of intentionality. But what is its intentionality? It's not in the hands of any person, any organization, anything we can figure out. It's just the Gaian will, and it's incomprehensible what is happening on this planet. It is like the metamorphosis that goes on inside the chrysalis, except this is a planet that is having its forests liquefied, its oceans boiled, its populations moved, its genes streaming in all directions with all these exotic toxins mixed in. And it has this, it isn't for death that it's moving, it's moving towards some kind of other thing, not death.
Yes, well, this is the new Gospel of St. John is what you're raising.
Gnostic apotheosis.
This is the green version of the apocalyptic vision, that the apocalypse is actually this ecological poison through the rampant infection of the planet by the human species.
Well, but is it poison? I mean, you have to remember that oxygen was a deadly gas that totally destroyed the biotic organization of this planet, and in fact, 1 billion years was spent responding to the presence of oxygen, yet it is the basis of all present life.
Yeah.
No, I think we're at the edge of the apocalypse.
An apocalypse without having the complete sterilization of the planet. Something on the on that order that took a mere billion years to recover. And the whole evolution of life on the planet begins again from scratch at the microbial level.
That's right. If these asteroid strikes, nothing larger than a chicken.
You have to say that satisfied the original St. John's description of the apocalypse.
Yes.
So that's it then. The green version, the green reinterpretation of the Bible identifies the present moment as the apocalypse.
Oh, I'm sure.
It's not even in 2012.
We're on the edge of the apocalypse. It's a time storm.
1847.
It's a time storm whose diameter is impossible to estimate, and all we know is that the barometric pressure is dropping faster than you've ever seen it drop, and there's an eerie stillness, and the light in the sky looks very strange, but nothing has happened yet.
It does seem to be out of hand as far as the scale of something that we could interact with in any way. I mean, we're the passive observers of this problem.
Well, if we could model it.
Well, are we the passive observers? I mean, we're also
magic, you mean?
Well, no, we can prepare.
Fractal dynamics, the apocalypse must have its own inner laws and dynamics. This is what we're attempting to do, I assume.
Yes, but it also, I mean, before we get into the actual mechanics, I think a bit more speculation is called for.
Surely not.
Assuming that human consciousness doesn't simply become extinguished at death, we have the question of what happens when millions of people die together, and what happened in Hiroshima when all those people died, or in Dresden when the firebomb attacks caused this fireball and firestorm in Dresden. All these people suddenly die together. They all pass through the state of the death experience, not the near-death experience, because this is for real. The death experience, which, from the descriptions we have, involves going through a tunnel, entering a new kind of realm, a different order of reality, rather like the birth canal, but into another dimension. Now, however we conceive of what happens at death, leaving aside only the materialist hypothesis that all just goes blank, the end of the world through any of these scenarios, billions of people, more than ever before, dying at once or by the million, is going to create an extraordinary flux of souls, to put it in traditional language, an unprecedented rate of flux, an unprecedented passage. And perhaps those who die in the same moment through the same cause undergo some kind of fusion. There may be some kind of psychic being, a kind of humanity. One way of picturing it in Christian terms is that what's happening to the earth is a global crucifixion. The whole of humanity is undergoing a kind of crucifixion, and there'll be a moment when the crucified body of humanity, through there's a collective moment at which humanity gives up the ghost, or at least large sections of it. The nuclear scenario, incidentally, according to its script since the Second World War, is essentially meant as the auto-destructive Christendom, because all nuclear targets, bar those in Turkey, which is in NATO, but NATO and Warsaw Pact countries, with the exception of Turkey, are all Christendom, and there's Western Christendom in Western Europe and the United States, and there's Eastern Christendom in the Soviet Union and Greece. And essentially, a nuclear thing would be the auto-destructive Christendom, which would be very much in the self-fulfilling prophecy mode of, this particular apocalyptic. But the environmental one is much more global. It's no longer, as we shift from our focus of attention to the dangers of nuclear war, not that there's any reason to shift from it, all the weapons are still there, but or as the fashion changes and we turn our attention to the global thing, we now see that this isn't just Christendom, it's everybody. Anyway, if it does involve everybody, then part of the omega point, or the thing that Terence is trying to describe, obviously involves some kind of transition in consciousness, which might be achieved through mass death, and might be achieved without mass death through something like that I think Terence rather vividly portrayed on one occasion as being like a kind of collective BMT experience.
The glory.
The glory.
You know about this.
I'm not sure that I can explain the glory.
It's they also call it the rapture. fundamental of
The rapture, yes.
and the eminent expectation of this thing that they call the rapture, which will be the opening note of the end of the world scenario. And
they're carried up into the heavens in the rapture. They're actually borne aloft.
Their clothes are left behind as they leave the automobiles going vertically to the sky.
That's the one, the rapture. See, it's interesting, because we all die, there is an apocalypse built in. It's just that it only happens to you. And so every human life becomes ultimately an approach to this question of final time. And what difference does it make that you're the only one that's going to die? After all, that's the one you're standing in.
Yes.
So it isn't that if you don't live in the age of the end of the world, you don't get to deal with the question of final time. It's just that in this age, the death of the individual and the death of the species are somehow both possible to contemplate.
Yeah. And the death of the other species.
And the death of the other. It may be, lots of traditions teach that life is organization for the purpose of creating a kind of after-death vehicle or some kind of structure in a higher dimension, which is, if carefully made, will survive some kind of transition that is potentially could fail, and that you're supposed to spend your life doing this. Well, if the sun were to explode, then the entire biological shell of organizational soul ecoplasm would be liberated in a fraction of a second, We don't know what life is for or what death is for.
But I think it certainly makes a difference. It certainly makes a difference to the way that individuals face death in what they believe happens to them afterwards. And people who've had near-death experiences, where they've experienced this going through a tunnel, an altered state of consciousness, out-of-the-body experience, so they have the sensation that there's something in them that leaves the body and survives it. An experience which I think is related to lucid dreaming, which in turn is related to dreaming, which is the experience we all have every night, whether we remember it or not, of travelling in other realms with another body, not the same as the physical body in bed, but an implicit body at least. And if the state of being after death is like dreaming without being able to wake up, so that when we die we are captured in the realm of our dreams, we pass through this tunnel and we enter a realm which is more like the realm of dreams than the life of waking experience. But there is indeed a post-mortal life in such a form glimpsed in dreams in some kinds of psychedelic experience where the barrier that's penetrated is maybe like the membrane or the barrier that we penetrate at death, and they may therefore be akin to near-death experiences, which I think DMT probably is. Then, if there is indeed this state of individual survival after death, we have to ask ourselves what would be the state of collective survival if indeed our billions of people were wiped off the earth. Most people don't want to think beyond that moment. It's a catastrophe. We must do everything that we can possibly do to avoid. And let's start by recycling our beer cans. That's the usual approach. But if you carry it through and see what might happen afterwards, vast numbers of people going through this barrier at the same time, creating a kind of group mind of a kind never before seen in the post-mortal plane, possessed of a powerful imagination, perhaps. I mean, if all of them passed through and believed in the New Jerusalem might indeed manifest in this plane, and there might be some kind of post-mortal state, which is the attractor. The point is that there are various ways of thinking of what it is that's drawing people to this millennium, both in expectation and in dread. I mean, this is the approach of, another metaphor is the Last Judgment, meeting God, as Terence put it, like the mind of God coming into history. It's a mixture. It's no longer just a loving God, but it's the image of God that certainly has the shadow side in it, because it's a dreadful moment.
Judgment.
Yes. Day of wrath and doom impending, as the Dies Irae puts it.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question as to why the apocalypse is such a strong attractor, and the attractor is that somewhere beyond that, all the doom and this moment, there's some other state of being which is extraordinarily blissful compared with anything we know here, and is utterly more perfect. And it's the same fantasy or dream that was the recovery of Eden, the going to the promised land, the coming to America, the transformation of the world through science and technology. There's something quite magical and infinitely attractive that's motivated the entire historical process. And if, in Terence's view, what we experience is some kind of shock wave coming back from the future, that this thing is going to happen, and its approach is sending back these kind of shock waves through time. Quite a powerful image, I think. Then we have to consider that this is what really is happening. It's the blissful state, or whatever this might be, that is actually acting as a historical attractor. It's so powerful an attractor is it, that whatever we do, we can't escape from it, once that's been conceived and allowed to infiltrate not just our religion, but our entire secular, political, and scientific and intellectual life.
So the justification for the omega point concept to share down is actually this mechanism built into the apocalypse vision.
The omega point is apocalypse. It's the Chardin's conception of the apocalypse, not just at a human level, but at a cosmic level.
Yes.
Yes, it happens to all nature.
And let me just add one more ingredient to this particular line of thought. When we were at Hollyhock recently, Brian Swim came up and was talking about his cosmological views. And he was exploring the idea that the universe, like a developing organism, has ages at which things happen. It has an inbuilt cosmological time. It's not like the old universe where galaxies were coming into being, others were dissolving. It just all went on forever in endless cycles. There was a time when atoms came into being first in the universe. There was a time when galaxies formed, or at least the great majority of them. There was a time when planets could form. Planets couldn't have formed a minute after the Big Bang. There was only a time after supernovae had been in existence, stars had formed in stardust from supernovae, the time when planets could form. So in a sense, just as in a developing embryo, the development has particular times or phases or synchronies. So if there were life on other planets, that the stage it's at might not be that very different from the stage ours is at. So I said to him, this was the most interesting line of thought, and since I'd also been thinking about parallel evolutions and their possible effect on ours through morphic resonance, interplanetary morphic resonance, similar Gaias in other solar systems, planets of the species Gaia will be in resonance with ours, and planets of the species Venus will resonate with Venus, and so on. But we're interested in the Gaian resonances. And I said, well, how far, in just sort of rough estimate, order of magnitude in time, do you think they'd be within 1 billion years of where we are, within 1 million, within 500,000, within 50, within 5? Where would you put it? He said, just guessing, 50 to 500,000 years of where we are. So there might be, you see, similar processes.
That's really a big bang.
I don't understand why he assumes that.
Because of this developmental theory.
I understand that, but my guess would be 500 million years. I mean, you have to be reasonable with the size of the universe.
Yes, but take into account morphic resonance. If there is indeed morphic resonance between the planets, so that when a new form appears on Earth, it's vastly more likely to appear on other planets. You could have a greatly accelerated evolution on other planets till they almost caught up. So if any got in far in the lead, the morphic resonance effect would tend to make the others catch up. It's a little bit like your time work.
Yes, it's a cosmic synchronization principle.
The nearest place you can check this is 4.5 light years away, and that may not be suitable. There is a sun-type star in Centauri, 1.1 solar masses. If there were an oxygen-rich, water-heavy planet there, you could... it could
Call
be a
them
twin
up.
Earth.
Call them
Haven't
up.
we been here somewhere before? This islander.
What are you doing about your apocalypse problem?
But the thing is, you see, that the Christian apocalyptic version, the vision, has several forms. One's the local human one. It just happens to people. Like the Jews going to the Promised Land. It didn't change all nature. It just meant they got other people's vineyards and took over other people's fields and killed the native inhabitants or reduced them to some second-class status. A repetitive pattern in history. And but this was a limited vision of where this whole process was led. Then it got more and more elaborated, this apocalyptic vision, until in time of Sheldrake, it's the end of the evolutionary cosmos. And it's not just the big crunch, it's much more immediate than that somehow. And so it's this attractor pulling forward. So it's this cosmic vision. But the thing is that it seems to us unlikely, given our standard old-fashioned cosmological view, that anything that happens on Earth would affect the rest of the cosmos. But if lots of Earths are synchronized, and if there are these, you see, then we do indeed begin to get the sense of the possible cosmic apocalyptic. And I don't know how much
that's an interesting idea.
Or maybe it's on the cosmic scale.
That the end time of the cosmos.
The end of the soul of the world.
The end of the yes, or the total transformation of the soul of the world. That it may be a maturation process, or that's, because present cosmology hasn't got very much to offer in the way of what happens in the future. Either you've got endless expansion, which seemed persuasive to people in the 1960s when it was generally believed that economies could go on expanding forever and forever. So the cosmos went on forever.
Yes.
Then people got worried about the big stock market crashes that all going, the whole thing ending in tears. Then we got more big crunch scenarios on the market. It may be just enough dark matter.
It's close to the indeterminate value they can't tell.
Exactly. Now they've got into a very subtle position, which I'm sure the medieval schoolmen would have admired as a solution to the problem, saying that we're hovering on the very brink between an ever-expanding and ever-collapsing, not so close to the margin that it's impossible ever to tell. Yes.
Okay.
So, but these are rather uninteresting visions of the future.
Well, you've actually created another mechanism for an apocalypse.
It happens somewhere else.
Yeah.
and then by this kind of imploding process, once one pops...
It's a chain reaction. And the stars would fall from heaven, and the lights of the galaxies would go out, and
it's similar to this time travel problem of collapsing time.
The God whistle, yes.
The God whistle.
That's right.
It's a spatial version of the God whistle.
Yes.
A synchronization of God whistles, cosmos-wide.
Yes, a cosmic chain reaction at a certain developmental stage that just pulls everything down into it. We have to believe that the universe is stranger than we can suppose.
Yes.
And that's the way. By avoiding closure and keeping that in front of us, I think we will not go far wrong.
The trouble is that at the apocalypse, if it happens, the hermeneutic cycle will come to an end.
Yeah.
If it happens in 2012, I'm sure I'll get no credit whatsoever for having been right.
I think it'd be a bit late for credit to be much value to you, wouldn't it?
I suppose so.
Well, raptural New Jerusalem might have to take its physical existence in another universe. I mean, only this universe will pop.
Right? Yes, well, what is it, this New Jerusalem that everybody leaves, this machine of sapphire and emerald and chalcedony that descends from the sky and in which there is, a world of delight before the presence of God? And this is the promise. This is the covenant. This is the fulfillment of the covenant. Is that the ocean will boil, everything will be lost, and do not give up the faith, because at the landing of the ark, the covenant was made, not with Abraham, but with Noah, with humanity, and it will be redeemed. There was all this, the pledge will be redeemed. The promise will be kept.
Don't throw away your coupons. They'll be cashed in due time.
That's right. The promise will be kept. I think it probably will be kept.
Well, I do believe we've transformed the apocalypse myth suitable for the purple and green church.
You think that
we've transformed it, yes.
Well, the Green Church of Brazil already has a version of the apocalypse myth, which is they believe in very strongly, and they, in theirs, the dragon in the last days comes and eats up the forest. They say it's an Inca prophecy, and burns and destroys. A dragon, incidentally, which is prophesied at the very beginning of Anglo-Saxon liberal political theory in Hobbes's model of Leviathan, because the dragon that's destroying the Amazon forest is the great monster Leviathan, which society, in Hobbes's view, is the aggregate, like cells in the body. Individuals are like atoms in the body of Leviathan.
And there's a dragon in the Revelation of St. John.
Yes. So
the Lady of Heaven crushes the head of the serpent.
So here's the serpent, which is, and in the last days, the struggle between the serpent and the forces of light grows ever more intense. People are forced to take sides because it no longer is possible to sit on the fence because the fence itself is crumbling. And there will be an intense polarization through the 1990s, in their view, towards the coming of the millennium, because these forces become ever more powerful, preparing for the final battle. Well, this is a fairly traditional version of the millennium. This is already one adopted by what one could call a green church. And it's one that sees the struggle that's going on now as being of uncertain outcome, in a sense. Although through faith in the victory over the dragon, the victory will be achieved through faith. So it's another form of seeing faith motivating faith in some future state, motivating the struggle. And it's a powerful inspiration. And actually, without some such inspiration, I don't think the green movement can function properly. Yeah. And that means that any apocalyptic vision that either sees the apocalypse as inevitable or as something we can't do anything about is, as you were suggesting earlier, perhaps destructive in its effect. But an apocalyptic vision which sees it as a process in which we're participants and to which we can make some difference, then unleashes this kind of heroic archetype. Incidentally, I think that both the conquest of nature and the environmental movement are under the aegis of the heroic archetype. In one of them, the heroes saving humanity from the ravaging powers of destructive nature, like the battle of doctors against cancer. In the other one, the environmentalist is saving the virgin nature from the onslaughts of this destructive dragon of our Leviathan, which is devouring the forest, polluting the world, shitting everywhere. So anyway, they're both under this archetype, and maybe it's too late for us to escape that particular heroic archetype either, because the only thing that can motivate the green movement is a heroic archetype, whether it takes the form of actual guerrilla fighting or whether it takes the form of non-violent resistance, a kind of Gandhian and Christian version which will generate martyrs who will then have this great archetypal appeal. But only some such millenarian faith, I think, could motivate the green movement sufficiently fast enough and sufficiently deeply enough to change the scenario. And so I think that this is another way of saying we're so in the fold of this millenarian in its field that only another millenarian scenario could possibly help undo it. Rubbing it out, getting rid of it, forgetting it, suppressing it, psychically engineering it out of our psyche, I think we're past all that.
Yeah. That's why a jihad to save the earth doesn't sound like a half-bad alternative.
And chaos became, and under chaos shall return.
The middle name of chaos is opportunity.
Well, we have to earn somewhere.